Hello, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're broadcasting to you on Channel 9 and also on WJOP-LP Newburyport FM 96.3. We're also coming to you on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm delighted to welcome two guests today. They've both written fascinating books, each of which will be featured at the Newburyport Literary Festival. First, we'll have Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett. She'll be here to talk about her book, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. And then Dr. Lydia Dugdale will be here in the second part of the show to talk about the lost art of dying and what these medieval texts, the Ars Moriendi, can teach us about how to live well. But first, let me introduce you to Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. She is among the top 1% of most cited scientists in the world for her revolutionary research in psychology and neuroscience. She is a university distinguished professor at Northeastern with appointments as well at Mass General and at Harvard Medical School. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Royal Society of Canada. She's also the author of 7.5 Lessons About the Brain, which she'll be talking about at the Literary Festival, and a little bit more about that later on. But we're lucky to have nabbed her today for a preview of her book, The Morning Show. So Lisa, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to visit the morning show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
It's an honor to have you here. Well, you know, Lisa, I admire a short book, and your book is short, but it's also turbocharged, I would say, with mind-expanding knowledge about brains. You clarify that many of the metaphors that we're accustomed to applying about the brain really are just that, just metaphors. And they may actually give us misguided notions about how our brains function. Significantly, let's start with the important framing half lesson with which your book begins. People talk and have talked for a long time about the triune or three-part brain that at the primal level is just supposed to be undergirded by the lizard or reptilian brain, and then is overlaid by the more recently evolved emotional or limbic brain, and then the most recently developed rational neocortex. So people often talk about our experiences as a struggle among the instinctual, the emotional, and the rational brain parts. And you describe this as an origin story, in other words, kind of something of a creation myth for the brain, and it ain't necessarily so. So please, Lisa, let's start. Would you please tell us what's mistaken about this model of the brain, and what's a more accurate way for us to conceive of the parts and the function of our brains?
Sure. So when I was thinking about writing this book, I really started with the question of why do we even have a brain? You know, like what's the brain good for? Because human brains are really expensive. I mean, your brain only costs you a mere 20% of your metabolic budget. I'm being sarcastic here. That's actually, so this little 3-pound blob between your ears is actually the most expensive organ you own. And so why do we even have it, and what's it good for? And it turns out that understanding a little bit about brain evolution also helps us to understand something about how it works and how our brains work fundamentally, how they're structured and how they work. And so if we go back to creatures, who didn't actually have brains, 550 million years ago, and we look at the dawn of the vertebrate brain, well, actually, I should say the dawn of vertebrates, when vertebrates evolved, and that's really when a full-blown kind of brain evolves. Invertebrates went their own way, and they also developed brains. But what we can see is that your brain's most important job is regulating the systems of your body. To regulate, glucose and water and salt and all of the things that are necessary to keep you alive and well. And I've described this as body budgeting, that your brain is running a budget for your body. And you can really think about the energy that you spend and the energy that you take in this kind of budgeting way. And that's your brain's most important job. So that's the first thing to understand, that we think about brains as being important for, the abilities that we hold very dear, particularly in the West, which is, thinking and rationality. And we kind of put those at the top of our wish list for things that we can do. And we think that the most evolved brains really do this well. But actually, that's really not the right way to think about it if you look at the evolutionary record. So the right way to think about it, at least as far as we know, based on the most up-to-date science, is that we think and see and feel and hear and do all these things actually in the service of regulating the body. Now, you and I don't experience every happiness, every moment of awe, every insult we bear, every hug we give in those terms, but your brain, but the brain does. It just doesn't make that information available to you. I think the other thing to understand is that if you look at the available evidence, it's not really the case that different functions are located in different parts of the brain. So it's not like you have one part of your brain for instincts and another part for emotion and another part, for rationality. And so your brain really isn't a battleground between your inner beast and your more rational self. That's a way of thinking about morality and also mental health that really we can trace all the way back to Plato. But the brain is not structured this way. Instead, the most, I would say, up-to-date way of thinking about a brain is that it's 128 billion little cells called neurons and some other supporter cells, about 70 billion, give or take, of those. And they're all networked together into one big complex network. And they can take on trillions of different patterns that create the features that you experience every day. And so thoughts and feelings and sights and sounds and actions can all be understood as emerging out of this, complex network, which is continually changing its patterns over time.
It's mind-boggling when you think of the scale of those little neurons that are busy working, as you put it, in an integrated way, with the fundamental goal being to manage our budget in an effective way so that we survive. And it's just such a fascinating way, and a different way. It kind of turns traditional notions not so much upside down as sort of inside out is how I'd put it.
Yeah, that's actually, I was going to say, oh, yes, it is inside, but you're actually right. Inside out is actually much better. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Lisa, why does it, you still read a lot about the triune brain, and it's clearly not up to date with the most modern understandings of the brain, but it's very popular with people. So how do you understand what makes this triune notion of the brain continue to be so popular in spite of up-to-date evidence that it's just not, that it's a misguided way to think about the brain?
Yeah, I don't think there's a single answer to that, Mary. I think it's probably, a consequence of many different factors. One factor is that a lot of the evidence, which is most important to showing that really there's a common brain plan for all, certainly for all mammals and probably, to some extent for all vertebrates, and meaning that the way that, our brains are set up as in when we're embryos is really, really similar to the way, a blood-sucking lamprey brain is set up, right? And so I think part of the issue is that information is siloed in literatures that are not easily accessible to even very accomplished scientists. So for example, I had a guide to that literature. I had to learn something about embryology in order to be able to read those papers. And that's not a trivial thing to learn, So I think part of it is that there hasn't been yet really good translation, kind of out of that literature, that very specialized literature. And there are a couple of books that have attempted to do this and one recent paper, but that was actually one of my motivations for writing this book, because I think it's not commonly known. I think also, though, Western civilization and our culture in particular has a really big investment in the triune brain, because our legal system is pretty much based on this idea that, your brain and the mind that it creates is this battleground between emotion and reason. And, when reason wins, you're a moral, respectable person who's healthy. And when, your inner beast wins, you're either immoral because you didn't try hard enough, or you're sick because you can't, you you couldn't actually execute reason in order to control your inner beast.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, economics is, you know, a field that really is heavily rooted in this kind of logic. So is psychology, and even modern neuroscience to some extent still is in a transition of really trying to understand how to think about really big questions, like when are you responsible for what you do?
Yeah.
And when are you responsible for the harms that you cause others? And what does it mean to live a meaningful, productive life? These are all questions that you have to start grappling with when you realize that the brain didn't evolve like layers of sedimentary rock.
Right.
And one of the reasons for writing this book was to try to introduce this idea to people and actually invite them to think about, well, what does it mean to be human then? And what kind of a human do you want to be, knowing that you have this kind of brain, but to do it in a way that would be easily accessible to people, where, you know, they have to really have no scientific background whatsoever in order to read, and maybe even kind of entertain them a little bit along the way, you know?
Yeah, which means people have the opportunity then to create different kinds of metaphors and stories or narratives, really, that perhaps are not foundationally competitive and adversarial, as so many of our institutions are. Yeah,
exactly. You know, my goal really was to not to tell people what to think, but really just to invite them to think about some of the big questions about what it means to be human, given that we have this particular kind of brain. Occasionally, I do voice my own opinions, and I try to broadcast that really clearly to people. You know, I'd say things like, I'm taking my lab coat off now, and I'm gonna, you know, and there are a couple of places where, you know, I felt like the research was strong enough, robust enough, that it was reasonable for me to voice an opinion, as long as I broadcast that really clearly. But most of the time, I'm really just trying to present the science in an accessible narrative that will linger with that, you know, entertain people in the moment. You know, my husband calls this book like the first neuroscience beach read, you know, and
it is.
and I'm glad to hear that. I mean, you know, I worked really hard, but also, you know, the idea would be that the questions kind of linger with you over time, and maybe you think about them, you know, beyond the point where you're reading the book.
Yeah, and I noticed every place where you would explicitly say, I'm taking my lab coat off now, and I'm expressing an opinion or telling a story, and that just, in my mind, gives you more credibility. So I also wanted to, related to what you're saying, you know, a lot of people take pride in inferring that human beings have superior intelligence because of our brain size. And the idea that our large neocortex displays a proportionate degree of rationality in contrast to other species. But again, you in the book point out, you're shaking your head already, and ain't necessarily so. The people who in turn interpret the brain this way may find what you explain about the brain to be humbling. But personally, so I think humility is a sign of higher intelligence. And so please enlighten us on why, when it comes to brains, let's say it this way, size just does not matter in the way we may have assumed.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, size matters a little bit, you know, when it comes to brains, and we won't comment about, you know, anything else, but size matters a little bit. But I think it's important to understand that there are animals who have a cerebral cortex, which is the part of the brain you're referring to, that's really much bigger than ours, actually. And they're not and they actually, those animals are special in their own way, but they're not, you wouldn't call them more intelligent necessarily. They're intelligent in their own way. And without, you know, we don't have time really today to talk about the ins and outs of what does it mean to be intelligent, and, you know, what are the features of intelligence, and how has that been, you know, understood. Instead, what I'll say is that, you know, our cerebral cortex is no bigger than the size that you would expect it to be for a primate of our body size, you know. Or let me say it differently, actually, because that's actually not quite right. It's really that the cerebral cortex is no bigger than we would expect it to be given a primate who has a brain the size of ours. So our brain is bigger, compared to say a chimpanzee, and our cerebral cortex is proportionally as big as you would expect it to be. There's really nothing special about the size of our cerebral cortex relative to the rest of the brain. It is true that our brains are slightly bigger relative to our body sizes. I want to be clear about that, than is true for other animals. But what makes us, what gives us the capacity to, explore the moon and discover, quantum mechanics and, invent, French fries, which frankly, I think are one of God's most perfect foods.
Oh, and yes, clearly. And chocolate chip cookies.
And chocolate chip cookies, yeah. So what gives us the capacity to do these things, to create great art, and so on, isn't really so much about the size of our cerebral cortex. And this is something I talk about in one of the essays. I believe it's the last lesson, lesson 7, where, the things that make a human brain special can all be found in other animal brains. So the things that we can do that make us special actually can be found in other brains too. What makes us special is that they all kind of entwine and coordinate with one another in a way that is unique compared to other animals. And so I think that's the first thing to understand. It's not really the size of the cerebral cortex that, or our degree of rationality that makes us unique in the animal kingdom. That's the first thing to understand. And I think the second thing to understand is that other animals are pretty cool, and what they can do is pretty cool, and we can't do a lot of those things. So for example, I just read, I think it was yesterday in the New York Times, about a species of ants called Indian jumping ants. And these ants they reduce the size of their brains as they're competing with one another to become queen. So basically, when the queen dies, these ants, the worker ants that are female, all the worker ants are females, they compete with each other in a tournament that can last days or weeks. And as this is happening, their ovaries expand 5 times the size, and their brains shrink 20%. Now, I can tell you that after I had my daughter, I very much felt like my brain had shrunk 20%. So maybe there's nothing new there. But the really cool thing is that when the tournament is over and the queen is chosen, all the other little worker ants grow back their brains to the normal size. Like, that's just, they basically can, shrink and expand their brain, right? And so, to the point being that there are animals who can do really remarkable things that humans can't do, and when we encounter these things, we usually endow them in our superheroes, like in stories.
Yes, we do.
So the human brain is not unique in its wondrous nature. There are many brains that are wondrous in their own right.
They absolutely are. That's an amazing story. There are many mysterious wonders out there. So thank you for teaching us about those ants. I'll contemplate
really fascinating.
That.
It's really fascinating.
Lisa, there is one lesson that I did want to be sure to ask you about in the time we have available, and that has to do with lesson 7, which you just were talking about. And that's our brain's ability through compression and abstraction to be able to create a social reality. And by social reality, that's any kind of concept that, like a nation state, that doesn't actually exist in the physical world, or money. And I was hoping it's such a relevant concept these days, but you do go into some detail about the concept of race and how it really it's not a biological concept so much as it is a social reality that our brains create. And I think this is so important. I love reading that because you made it so clear. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Sure. So I'm going to take one step back, Mary, and talk about the visible light spectrum first, because I think it will help to set up what I want to say about skin tone and race. So we have retinas, the cells in the back of our eyes that can detect light at a variety of frequencies, which in what we call the visible light spectrum. And in different cultures, we draw different lines in that visible continuous spectrum. We draw different lines and categorize those wavelengths differently. So, in our culture, we have red and blue and green and so on. And in the Barrett culture, it's in New Guinea, they have red or I should say they have brown and green. So the wavelengths of light, which are red to us, are actually just part of green. I'm sorry, part of brown to them.
Interesting.
And so there's really tremendous variability from culture to culture in how we learn how to make sense of those that gradation as categories, and we act on the light colors, differently depending on how we make sense of them. And so there's something very similar is true for skin tone. So skin tone, really the amount of melanin you have in your skin that makes it very light or very dark, is evolved under the selection pressure of two competing hormones. So I, for example, am melanin challenged, right? I have very light skin, and I would do really well in a climate that doesn't have a lot of UV sunlight. And I have the reason why is that if your skin is very dark, then you probably have ancestors who lived for some time at the equator, where a lot of the UV light is shielded or sort of bounced off the skin. And that allows, there's enough there to keep a vitamin D healthy, but also not enough to break down folic acid, which is one of the B vitamins. However, I, with light skin, live in a climate, and my ancestors lived in a climate with not very much UV light. And so I need to absorb as much sunlight as possible. My problem, right, would be that I'm not going to get enough vitamin D because my body won't make enough vitamin D if I don't get enough sun. And so there's this tug of war between, if you have too much if you don't have enough vitamin D, you can die of rickets. And if you have not enough folic acid, you can also die for a different reason. And so skin tone, which is continuously varying across people, right? Like some people, there are no real boundaries there. Some people have, very little melanin in their skin, and all the way to some people who have a lot. It's just a continuum. That's, under the selection pressure of biological features in the world. But at some point, somebody came along and drew a line in that continuum, not always in the same place. And but drew a line and said, okay, the people on this side of the line belong to this group, and the people on this side of the line belong to this group, and then proceeded to treat people differently on the basis of that line. Usually light-skinned people drawing the line, to basically disadvantage the people who with darker skin. That's, something that happened a long time ago and is maintained over many generations. And the important thing to understand here is that just in the same way that we can draw a line in the color spectrum, or we can draw a line in the dirt and say, okay, that's the boundary of a country. And as long as we all agree that it's the boundary of a country, it becomes the boundary of a country. And then we create, immigrants and citizens of that country. Or foreigners and citizens. In much the same way, many years ago, people drew lines in the continuum of skin color to the advantage of some people and the disadvantage of others. And that persisted over time. So basically, we were imposing a function or a meaning on a feature, a physical feature, skin tone, that it did not evolve to have. And that skin color became a symbol to stand in for something else that it never evolved to really be related to. And this is an example of what we call social reality. It's what we do as humans all the time. We agree that little pieces of paper can be traded for material goods, and poof, we have money. Yeah. And if some people withdraw their consent, then the function of the function of those papers as money goes away. I mean, that's basically what happened in the mortgage crisis, right?
Yeah, right.
And much of the reality that humans live in is created in this way. By collective agreement, we impose functions on things that they actually physically weren't, originally evolved or didn't originally, they weren't meant to have. But if we all agree that they have that function, then poof, they have that function.
Right.
And I just want to say one other thing. The important thing here to understand is that when I say that this is social reality, I don't mean to imply that there isn't a physical consequence for people when these lines are drawn.
Yeah.
So physical reality and social reality have this interesting relationship. I've written about this a little bit in the book, and also, on my website, there are some articles that I've written about this, particularly in relation to COVID. It's important to understand that we actually can shape the biology of other people by virtue of the social reality that we create. So we can make people healthier or less healthy, for example, just by virtue of drawing these illusory lines and then acting on them like they're real.
Yeah. What I love about the way you talk about race, is it's so cogent. It's scientific, but it's also crystal clear. And you also, in your book, you talk about this ability to develop social realities that have a real force and power to them as a superpower that our brains have. But you make the point that it's really helpful, it's most powerful, and they work best when you understand that you have one and you're using it for certain kinds of impacts, because then you can step away from it and reflect upon it and possibly, as you say, use it in better ways. So thank you for that, Lisa. I have to say, we've just scratched the surface of your book, even though we've run out of time. And so the good news is that people can go to your Newburyport Literary Festival appearance, which will be Saturday, April 24th at 10 a.m. Just go to newburyportliteraryfestival.org and you get all the information that you need, and you'll be able to register for Professor Barrett's book, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. And I promise you, you're not going to want to miss any of those lessons, because it's so powerful and it's so well written and so entertaining. It is a scientific beach read. So Lisa, thank you so much for taking time to visit the morning show. I really appreciate it. It's a wonderful book.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. And now I'm so happy to welcome Dr. Lydia Dugdale. She's director of the Center for Medical Ethics and associate professor of medicine at Columbia University. And prior to that, she was associate director of the program for biomedical ethics at Yale. She's an internal medicine and primary care doctor, and she's also the author of the fascinating book, The Lost Art of Dying, which she will be presenting about at the Newburyport Literary Festival, and more on that in a little bit. Lydia, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to visit the morning show.
Thank you so much for having me, Mary.
Oh, I've been looking forward to this for some time. Lydia, your book begins with a cautionary tale about a frail elderly patient in the process of dying who was resuscitated twice in one night, only to inevitably die soon thereafter. This was his family's choice for him. And you use the phrase medicalized death, such as this man's, being very different from the process they were accustomed to seeing on TV shows, where they rush in and give somebody CPR. What did you want people to understand better about the impact that this type of resuscitation has on the human body?
Sure, that's a great question to start us off. Resuscitation in the hospital began initially on patients who had just come out of cardiac surgery. So this is going back to the 60s. So they tended to be younger patients who stood to benefit from resuscitation. And how it's come to play out is this kind of last ditch effort to save every single body. And we know that resuscitation often is highly unsuccessful in certain, we use the language in medicine, hosts in certain bodies. So that would be the very elderly. That would be people with multiple medical problems and or people with advanced disease. So in the case of the gentleman I described in the book, he had widely metastatic cancer. Cancer spread all over his body. So even if we were able to get his heart going again, right? Sort of restart the engine of the heart. We knew very well, we knew without doubt that his heart would stop again soon thereafter. And part of why medical people are loath to attempt resuscitation, especially on people we know who won't stand to benefit, is because the act of resuscitating itself is it's highly invasive and it's actually quite gruesome. And I don't want to go into details at the moment, but it's really awful to inflict, and it feels like a horrible thing to do to someone who is dead, to a body that is dead, in the hopes of maybe getting a few more minutes or a few more hours of life. So it causes great distress for us to do it. And one of my hopes is that people would be able to come to be able to assess sort of where they're at with their health and maybe rethink some of these extreme measures at the end of life.
And was that why you decided that this would be a good way to frame the opening of your book? Because it certainly, you give a vivid description in the book of the assault on the body, which is just heartbreaking when you think about the frail elderly bodies often this is inflicted on. And was that why you decided you wanted to open your book with this cautionary tale?
That's right. I mean, CPR is something that people understand. They see it in the movies, right?
Yeah,
it's like a 70% success rate in the movies and like 10% success rate everywhere else, if that. So it's something people can relate to, and it's the hospital itself is a common. I mean, that's where we expect death to happen. Yeah,
that's right. Well, let's talk about the Ars Moriendi. Your book is positioned as a modern version of the Arts of Dying, and please tell us about why and when this particular body of literature that describes practices for dying well developed.
So great. I was so troubled by this medicalized dying, which is all the time in the hospital. And I'm a medical doctor. This has been bothering me since the beginning of my training. And so the question that I've been puzzling over for many, many years then is, how could we do this differently? And part of the question is, how can we empower patients? So it's, doctors and healthcare systems have competing interests. And certainly care for bodies in ICUs and intensive care units are also financially lucrative for an institution. And I'm not saying that we keep people alive because, we're trying to make money, but it's complicated. Healthcare systems are complicated. So part of my goal has been to empower individuals to ask the right questions, empower individuals to think through their own lives, their own health, their own communities, and how we might die better. So to that end, I'd been puzzling over this. What's the answer? What's the answer? What's the answer? And I came across this genre of literature maybe a dozen years ago now, and it's called the Ars Moriendi, which is Latin for art of dying. And it developed during the aftermath of the bubonic plague that struck Western Europe in the mid-1300s. This particular outbreak of plague was devastating. It took the lives of as many as 2/3 of Western Europeans, not to mention folks further afield, but that's sort of the numbers that historians give us. Somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of Western Europeans died. And we're in a pandemic right now, and you think about 3 million lives lost worldwide, which is devastating. But to think of 1 out of 3 or 2 out of 3 dying from coronavirus, I mean, we can't imagine those numbers. So, this is the late Middle Ages. The social authority at the time is the Western Church, sort of with a uppercase C. And the church, there were some priests who were enormously helpful. attended the sick and dying. There were other priests who died themselves in the effort. And then there were priests who frankly skipped town, right? They did not want to get their hands dirty. They were well connected, and they just got out of these urban centers, which is where plague primarily concentrated because of the rats that were attributed to the spread of the disease. And so that left us with a real crisis, because who was going to help people prepare for death if the social authority was not reliable? And what I liked about this then is I'm thinking, okay, well, how can we help patients? If doctors are variable, right? We know doctors are bad prognosticators. We know some doctors don't like to talk about death. We know doctors don't like to share good news, right? There's all these ways that doctors themselves are human, right? We ourselves are human, and we fall short. So then what can we do? How can we put the tools in the hands of the people? So that's the question. And the Ars Moriendi became then this series of handbooks that developed during the aftermath of the plague. Initially, the earliest iterations seemed to be affiliated with the church. So it was sort of a pastoral response, if you will. But then there were many, many spin-offs, so many iterations of these handbooks, and they spread all over Western Europe. They were adapted and adopted for different languages, different cultures, different religious groups, and even non-religious groups. So suddenly we have these tools, these kind of, I don't want to say this, but I will, the dying for dummies, right?
Which is all of us.
Right, that's right. But people had in their hands. And the amazing thing is that the printing press is developing during this time also. So, and then there was even a version which really speaks to the art of dying that was illustrated. And the illustrated versions would have been studied by the illiterate or the semi-literate or the lesser educated, so that even those who weren't formally trained, formally educated, could study these images and themselves anticipate and prepare for death. And so I just loved this model. I fell in love with it. And I thought, this is what we need. This is a tool, puts the tools in the hands that need them, which is to say all of us, and helps us begin this journey now while we're healthy, right? Or even if we're sick now, but while we're still alive. And it becomes this lifelong preparation. The closest thing we get to it today is probably estate planning. But that falls far short of what the Ars Moriendi purported to do.
A very different focus. And indeed, the wisdom from the Ars Moriendi it's quite fascinating and timeless. I mean, one understands the impulse from your description of the prominence of the plague and the ubiquity of illness and dying all around one. And you understand the incentive to come up with a guidebook because you couldn't have gotten away from it. But a fundamental idea was the linkage between the art of living well and the art of dying well. That was one of the main teachings, as you describe in your book. To live well meant to prepare for death over the course of a lifetime. And yet today, these ideas, that linkage between preparation for death means to live well means to prepare for death, they seem in our modern culture to have been severed almost entirely, except for estate planning, I suppose. And I wonder if you could comment upon what made us stop thinking about these things as fundamentally linked, so that we don't like to think about death, and we no longer, for the most part, see it as an essential ingredient in living well?
Yeah. Great question. So the art of dying body of literature, this genre of literature, was wildly and widely popular for more than 500 years. So it really kind of came on the scene in the early 1400s, dies out in the early 1900s. What do we know about the early 1900s? Well, before I get to that, let me back up. There are several other factors that led to the demise of the art of dying, a part of which was the relocation of people from the countryside to urban centers for work as industrialization advanced. Right. So that was the first thing. There no longer were these kind of big ramshackle country homes where extended families could care for the sick and dying. People are now living in small flats in the city, working in factories, And they don't have space or manpower, frankly, to care for the sick. So that was part of it. But part of it then is the early 1900s. And what do we see? Well, we have World War I, 1914 to 1918, US involvement, devastating war, enormous loss of life. Millions and millions of soldiers died around the world, but also civilians, women and children. And even before World War I ended in 1918, we have the outbreak of the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920. And if you read descriptions of the, actually, so I've read descriptions of the autopsies from that time of young soldiers, 20-year-old men, 21-year-old men who are so fit. And yet their lungs, when they remove the lungs from the body on autopsy, are just dripping with influenza. And with the virus itself and the associated inflammation from having such a severe infection. People were sick beyond belief, enormous death toll, right? So just by way of numbers, think about this, 675,000 Americans were estimated to have died from influenza pandemic, 1918 and 1920. We're at 562,000 deaths. But the population of the US at the time was 1/3 what it is now. So if you put us up to around 2.2 million deaths in the United States, that will feel like what it felt like in 1918, 1920. So then we emerge out of this horrible 6-year period of death, 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 and death. And what happens in the US is a period of immense economic prosperity. Again, it's interesting to think about what's going on now in the country with the spending boom, trying to get the economy going, right? The push right now is not to say, wow, we've just lost 3 million lives worldwide from this horrible pandemic. We've been locked down for more than a year. How should we anticipate our death and plan for them? No, the impetus now is let's get on with life. Let's plan that vacation we've been wanting to take. Let's do our home renovation, right? All of this is about living well. And the same thing happened in 1920. So we move into the roaring 20s, women's dress changes. There's, talk radio, there's motion pictures, there are new cars. Fashion is incredibly different. Women get the right to vote. And then we have the birth of antibiotics, chemotherapy, organ transplantation. And suddenly anyone who's born after World War II, like the baby boomers and younger, have never seen death. Like earlier generations had seen it. And frankly, after 6 years of World War I and flu pandemic, people did not want to return to traditional mourning practices. They were frankly sick of thinking about dying well. And so even if you study the texts of homilies in churches, which was a place where, they would typically talk about this kind of thing. Even the texts of the priests and the pastors, it changed from being about preparing for death, living and dying well, to just living well. It was really about getting on with life and, death be damned. And that was sort of what happened.
Oh, that's a fascinating parallel that you draw, because absolutely, I've seen numerous articles about we're preparing for another roaring 20s. And the concern about it isn't that we've forgotten that we're still mortal, but that there might be a crash then, in 2029. So anyway, that's fascinating. One of the arts that stood out to me in your book, because it's just such a contrast to the way death is managed today, was the idea of death as a public and communal event during the time that people were reading the Ars Moriendi. And today, death is much more often isolated and kind of hushed and discreet. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how death was experienced as more of a public event, often with witnesses from the community or even the participation of total strangers, and say what was wise or helpful to humans about that and how that might be applied today.
Yeah, so in the late Middle Ages, particularly, there's Philip Aries is a French historian who wrote this 1,000-year sort of review of practices of dying and death in the West. And that's very helpful for it's a massive book. It's helpful for getting a sense of what people did. But one of the things were these mourning practices and attending the body. So for example, in a village, or say even in a bigger city within one's parish or one's neighborhood, so to speak, if a person died, the entire community, right, defined by the parish or the neighborhood, would file in past the deathbed. As someone was dying, they would all come in. It was expected that the men would gather. So when they were preparing for the funeral and the burial, the men would gather outside the home. And this was, and would await the priest or the clergy person. The women would be in attending to the body and doing the public displays of mourning. Now, some of that was performative. Some of it was community obligation, even without a sense of true empathy, perhaps. But there was this idea that we do particular things when someone dies, and there's a way that we come in and support. And as you know, because you've read the book, I also talk at great length about Jewish mourning rituals, which I think are amazing. Yeah. Amazing. So a lot of what I'm talking about is the dominant culture in Western Europe in the late Middle Ages. But frankly, within Jewish communities, there was very, very exquisite mourning rituals, and continue to be today. Actually, I think the Jewish mourning and death rituals probably far surpass any others in terms of coherence, consistency over time, and attention to the family of the bereaved. But so what can we learn from this? I think what we can learn partly is that within our communities, however those are defined, whether it's the nuclear family or the extended family or a religious context or a community group, when you do the sort of thought experiment of considering who you would want at your deathbed, and then you kind of work backwards to say, how am I investing in those people now? How am I building up my community now? And I tell the story in the book of one of my patients who, when she received this terminal diagnosis, said, I'm going to get that, I'm investing in those people. And she really, and they were already good friends, but she helped name the importance of them to her and invited them into this process of accompanying her as she declined, as she was dying. Yeah. So I think we need to attend to that, because we live in a society where people, what the average American moves every 5 years or something like this, right? So we are rootless. And because of our rootlessness, we often aren't really investing in those relationships. But we should say, wherever I am now, who are my people? Right. And how am I going to, how are we going to have this conversation? Right. Because it's not just about the funeral or mitigating medicalized dying, or, where I will be buried or what my will be like, but it's the composite. Yeah. Along with the opportunity to wrestle with some of these bigger questions, like what is death and what happens when I die, and is there an afterlife? These sorts of very human questions communities have worked out over time. And I, I've taken care of patients who are dying and then sort of asking me, the doctor, what happens? It's kind of too late to work out one's beliefs, once you're actively dying. Right.
Well, what I like about what you're saying is that there's two parts to it. One is that when someone dies, there's a gap in the family system and in the community system and the larger system. And so it's a way of acknowledging that gap so you can tend to it tenderly, as sitting Shiva does in the Jewish tradition. But it also is part of preparing to live well, as you say, because it means thinking about, do I have a community? Do I need a community? And in my opinion, we all need a community. And perhaps I'd best start thinking about how I can build one. Because that way you both have the companionship and the connective tissue of other humans while you're alive, but you can also anticipate it being there for you to help you with those answers to those questions, perhaps, that you were just saying. You don't want to put them off. So I thought there was a lot of wisdom in that. Lydia, this is maybe a larger question than we have time for, but I'm curious, how did writing The Lost Art of Dying impact you? Do you feel that it has helped you to live well?
Definitely. It's interesting. I have an earlier academic book too. So I've been kind of writing about death for a really long time, which means I have books about death scattered all over my apartment in New York. And my children are forever saying, "Oh, mommy, not another one, not another one." But, it's been interesting. I finished the book manuscript a year and a half before it was published, and it came out just a few months into the pandemic. So it's a book that in some ways riffs off of this idea of plague, to ask how death forces us to think about our living and dying. To have this book come out in the midst of a pandemic, which I could have never anticipated, has been very interesting and has informed a lot of our conversations, both as a family with my children and my spouse, but also my broader communities. So one of the things that's been so fascinating to me, I talk in the book about the Jewish ritual of Tahara, which is washing and preparing the body and then wrapping the body and preparing it for burial, which traditionally takes place within Jewish communities and not, it's not a process that's necessarily doled out to a funeral director, although sometimes it still is. Whereas the context in which I was raised is sort of you line up the funeral director, you get embalmed, and that's just what you do. That's what everybody does. Open casket, kind of the embalmed body there. And I've been thinking a lot about how incredible it would be to reclaim that art of washing and preparing a body within the context of one's community. And just the tenderness and the intimacy and the care and the love. We can do this. This is something people have been doing for thousands of years of recorded history, right? So it's something that we can reclaim. But how does that happen in New York City? If a community member dies in the hospital, do I take a taxi to the morgue? I mean, just trying to think through the practical, how this plays out practically. At the same time, it's a real challenge to me to think about what do I want to do differently? So not only the conversations with my kids about, hey, we're in a pandemic, mommy's a doctor, she's taking care of coronavirus patients. We may not make it to the other side of this pandemic and all be alive. So how do we treasure our relationships now? How do we nurture our family now, and those we love, our neighbors, et cetera? But also what would we want to do differently about our dying? And so I have my own challenges, certainly, yes, from writing the book.
You just very eloquently articulated the connection between the art of dying and living well, because thinking about these things and the connections between them clearly is part of elevating your awareness and your consciousness to be more expansive and aware and conscious about every aspect of your life, the living and the anticipated dying. And since we're all mortal, best be prepared. Well, right. You're going to be at the Newburyport Literary Festival Saturday, April 24th, pretty soon at 2:30 p.m. And I want people to know that we have just scratched the surface of what's in your book. So absolutely register for it at www.newburyportliteraryfestival.org. And the title of your presentation will be Medical Ethics in a Time of COVID, with the featured book being The Lost Art of Dying. Lydia, I just wanted to say that your book has, one of the things you talk about is the resources we have to deploy in our efforts to live well and to plan to die well. And prominent among them, as you suggest, is, and I'm quoting you now, change that comes from experiencing the profound. We grow wiser, more whole. We discover calm in turmoil, light in shadow, beauty in decay, which is so beautifully put. And your book provided for me many, many countless experiences of the profound. And as I say, we only scratched the surface of the profound ideas and experiences that you have included in your book. So thank you for that. So I encourage everyone to take the opportunity to learn more about the Ars Moriendi at the Newburyport Literary Festival this Saturday, the 24th at 2:30 p.m. So Lydia, thank you so much for your book, first and foremost, and the profound ideas that I found in it. I found it just enormously thought-provoking, in some ways comforting, because I felt like if I really put my mind to contemplating these profundities, I would live better. So thank you for that. And thank you so much for taking time to visit the morning show.
Thank you, Mary. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. You take care now.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye. Good luck at the festival.
Thank you.